Montana Territory, 1887. Jonas Whitmore had $11 folded in his coat pocket, and a 6-year-old daughter asleep against his shoulder in the back of a borrowed wagon. That was the whole of what he had left. He'd sold his own spread 2 winters back, after the fever took his wife, and half his herd in the same bad month. And since then he'd been drifting from ranch to ranch, taking day work where he could find it, never staying long enough to plant anything or promise anybody anything. He was 34 years old. He had rough hands, a quiet way with spooked animals most men couldn't manage, and a name that used to mean something in 3 counties. Though he never said so out loud anymore, talking about who he used to be didn't put beans in the pot. That morning he'd heard the Kestrel Ranch was hiring. Biggest spread in the territory. Run, these past 6 months, by the old rancher's only child, since her father's heart had given out and left her 4,000 acres, 2,000 head, and a debt to nobody but pride. Folks in town called her the Iron Miss. Not always kindly. Jonas pulled the wagon up to the Kestrel gate a little past 7. Etta stirred awake, rubbing her eyes with the back of one small fist. "Are we staying here, Papa?" "Depends," he said, "on whether the lady of the house likes what she sees." He didn't expect she would. A man in a patched coat with a child underfoot rarely got taken seriously for real work, not in this territory. Not by anybody with better options. But $11 wouldn't stretch past the week. He looked down at Etta a moment, at the small crease of worry already sitting between her brows. Far too old a look for a 6-year-old to be wearing. "Whatever happens in there," he told her, "you did nothing wrong. You hear me? Nothing that happens today is any doing of yours." "I know, Papa," she said, in the patient tone of a child who has heard the reassurance before and understands, better than her father wishes she did, exactly why it keeps needing saying. He lifted her down, took her small hand in his, and walked toward the biggest ranch house he'd seen in 2 years, praying quietly. The way he prayed about most things these days, that his pride wouldn't cost them both this one chance. Charlotte Kestrel was standing at the corral fence when he arrived, sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching a big gray stallion send yet another hired hand sprawling into the dirt. She was 29 years old. She'd spent 6 months running this ranch on nothing but her father's ledgers and her own stubbornness, and every week some new man showed up at her gate, certain he understood her business better than she did. Every week, she'd had to prove him wrong. She was tired down to her bones of proving people wrong. Her foreman, an older man named Dale, who'd worked for her father 20 years, stood beside her shaking his head at the corral. "That's 4 trainers this month, Miss Kestrel. Might be the horse simply can't be broke." "Everything can be broke, Dale," Charlotte said, not looking away from the stallion. "Question's only ever whether the man trying knows the difference between breaking and ruining." That was when she noticed the wagon at the gate. "If you're here about the hand's position, I've had 4 men try that horse already," she said without turning around, before Jonas had said a word. "All 4 failed. Don't waste my time telling me you'll do better." "Wasn't going to tell you anything," Jonas said. "Figured I'd just try." She looked him over then. The patched coat, the child gripping his hand, the unhurried way he stood at her fence, as though the chaos in the corral wasn't chaos at all to him. "Fine," she said, sharp as a slap. "Fix it. Or don't bother." Jonas knelt down to Etta's height. "Stand right here, sweetheart. Hold the wagon horse for me." Etta took the reins with enormous seriousness, the way she took most things he handed her since her mother passed. He climbed the corral fence. Dale muttered something to Charlotte that Jonas didn't catch, and Charlotte's mouth pressed into a thin line. Though whether it was doubt or something else, Jonas couldn't have said. He didn't reach for a rope, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood still, let the stallion circle him, snort at him, work out its fear in its own time, the way he'd learned from a man who'd taught him everything he knew about animals and grief both, years back, on a ranch that no longer belonged to him. Charlotte watched, arms crossed, saying nothing. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Dale shifted his weight, clearly ready to call it a lost cause, and send the stranger on his way. Charlotte held up one hand, quiet, not taking her eyes off the corral. 20 minutes on, the stallion stood calm at Jonas's shoulder, nose pressed into his open palm. How, Charlotte said. It wasn't really a question. He wasn't broke, Jonas said, climbing back over the rail. Just scared. Man tries to make an animal forget it's scared instead of letting it be scared and get past it. He'll fight that horse forever and call it the horse's fault when he loses. Charlotte studied him a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes that she didn't let show on her face. Name, Jonas Whitmore. You're hired, Mr. Whitmore, provisionally. Her eyes flicked to Etta. The girl stays in the bunkhouse kitchen during work hours. I run a ranch, not a nursery. Understood. Don't make me regret it. She walked off before he could answer, and Dale lingered a moment, looking at Jonas with a new kind of interest. 4 trainers, Dale said. You want to tell me your secret? No secret, Jonas said. Just patience most men don't have time for anymore. Jonas let himself breathe. Just for a second, the first real breath he'd taken since Cheyenne, and picked Etta back up onto his hip, though she was near too big for it now, and carried her toward the bunkhouse to find her something to eat. 3 days in, Charlotte found him alone in the barn before dawn, bent over the account books she'd left out the night before, lamp still lit. That's not your business, she said, sharper than she meant. No, ma'am, Jonas agreed, not looking up. But your feed suppliers been charging you 11 cents a sack over market for 4 months running. Figured you'd want to know before you signed the next order. She checked the figures herself that evening, sitting at her father's old desk with the ledger spread open under the lamp, tracing the columns with one finger. He was right, down to the penny. She sat with that a long while, turning it over. It would have been easy enough for a hired hand to keep quiet about a cheating supplier, to let the ranch bleed 11 cents a sack while he collected his wages and minded his own business. Most men would have. She didn't thank him aloud. But she stopped locking the ledgers away after that, and something in how she watched him across the yard the next morning had shifted, though she couldn't have said exactly how. A week later, a squall blew in past midnight, hard enough to spook the whole stable. Half the hands were slow getting out of their bunks. Jonas was already out there, coat soaked through, working stall by stall in the dark, when Charlotte came running out in a borrowed coat over her nightclothes to help. You didn't wake anybody, she said, breathless, grabbing a lead rope. Didn't need to wake anybody who wasn't already awake, he said. Horses were making enough noise for the both of us. They worked side by side for 2 hours straight, hardly speaking, moving fast and sure together, passing buckets, calming a young mare who'd near thrown a shoe kicking at her stall door, hauling a fallen beam clear of the north pen before it could splinter further, until the last horse was settled, and they stood in the barn doorway, both soaked to the bone, laughing a little wildly at how they must look. You didn't have to come out here yourself, Jonas said. Could have sent Dale. Dale sleeps like the dead, Charlotte said. Besides, it's my ranch. Seemed wrong to let somebody else stand in the storm for it while I stayed dry. That how you see everything? Yours to stand in the storm for? She considered that a moment, water dripping off the brim of her hat. Everything that's mine, yes, she said. Never learned any other way to hold on to something. For a moment neither of them moved to go back inside. Etta took a fever in October, nothing dangerous. The way children's fevers so rarely are, but bad enough that Jonas sat up 3 nights straight, worn thin with the particular worry of a father who has nobody else to share it. On the 3rd night, Charlotte appeared at the bunkhouse kitchen door with cool cloths and a bowl of broth she'd made herself, badly, her first real attempt at cooking in years. It's terrible, she admitted, setting it down. I know it's terrible. My mother used to make this and I never learned it right. She died when I was 9, and after that it was just father and the ranch, and neither of us had much use for kitchen recipes. You didn't have to make anything at all, Beth said, taking the bowl gently. I know, Charlotte said, but it seemed wrong to let a sick child go without somebody trying, even if the trying came out terrible. Etta drank it anyway and declared, with the brutal honesty only a 6-year-old can manage, It's not very good. But thank you for trying, Miss Charlotte. Charlotte laughed for the first time in weeks, and something in her chest loosened that she didn't examine too closely that night. She stayed another hour, sitting at the edge of Etta's cot, telling her a rambling, half-remembered story about a horse her own father used to keep, until the girl's fever finally broke and she drifted into an easier sleep. Jonas watched her from the doorway the whole while and said nothing, because there are moments a man learns not to interrupt. By November, Jonas had quietly mended nearly every broken fence line on the property without being asked and without charging a single extra hour. A habit he couldn't explain, except that an unfinished job bothered him, the way an unfinished sentence bothers some people. Dale noticed it before Charlotte did, and mentioned it to her over supper one evening. Man's fixed near 2 miles of fence line this month. Never once put in for the extra hours. Why wouldn't he put in for the hours? Charlotte asked, genuinely puzzled. Didn't ask him, Dale said. But if I had to guess, I'd say some men just can't abide leaving a thing broken, whether anybody's paying them to fix it or not. Charlotte noticed after that. She noticed everything about him now, if she let herself be honest, which she mostly tried not to be. She left a new coat hanging on a nail in the barn, his old one worn thin at the elbows, and told the foreman it was leftover stock. A small, transparent lie nobody in the bunkhouse believed, and nobody was foolish enough to mention. Late in November, a buyer came through from Cheyenne, looking to purchase 6 head of breeding stock, and offered Charlotte a price nearly a third below fair market. Banking, as men often did, on the assumption that a woman running her own ranch wouldn't know the difference. Jonas said nothing during the negotiation. He simply stood near the corral fence, arms crossed, watching the stallion graze, the very picture of a hired hand minding his own business. But when the buyer named his figure, Charlotte glanced once toward Jonas, the smallest, quickest look, and found him giving the faintest shake of his head, so slight a stranger wouldn't have caught it at all. That's $11 a head under what the Lindqvist Ranch got for lesser stock last month, Charlotte said, not missing a beat. I read the auction records myself. You'll want to come up some, or I'll wire Cheyenne and see who else is buying this season. The buyer blinked, clearly having expected less resistance, and came up $30 on the spot rather than lose the sale entirely. Afterward, once the wagon had rolled off down the road, Charlotte turned to Jonas. You knew that figure before I said it. I read the same auction records you did, Jonas admitted. Went through your father's old papers one evening, looking for something else, and got curious about market prices. Didn't think it was my place to say anything unless you asked. It wasn't your place, Charlotte agreed, but I'm glad you knew it anyway. By December, it wasn't unusual at all for Charlotte's evenings to end at the barn instead of the house, going over the day's work with Jonas, long after there was any real work left to discuss. They talked about the herd, about the price of beef in Cheyenne, about nothing at all. The easy, meandering talk of two people who have run out of reasons to need an excuse to be near each other. Neither one of them called it anything. They just called it the evening rounds. I want to pause just a moment here, friends, and thank you, truly, for spending this evening with me. This story has traveled further than I ever expected, reaching listeners clear across different countries, and that still catches me by surprise every time. Now, back to Jonas and Charlotte. It was Etta who said it plainly, the way children usually do. A Sunday in late December, Charlotte reading to her by the fire, a habit that had started as convenience, and become, somewhere along the way, something neither adult examined too closely. Etta looked up mid-story. Miss Charlotte, are you going to marry my papa? Charlotte's hands went still on the page. Across the room, Jonas, mending a bridle, went very quiet. That's not really something children ask, sweetheart, Charlotte managed. Why not? Etta said. You're here every night. You made me soup even though it was bad. Papa smiles different when you're around. Seems like the kind of thing that's already happening whether anybody says it or not. She shrugged and went back to her book, entirely unaware of the small earthquake she'd just caused in the room. Neither adult spoke for a long moment. Out of the mouths of babes, Charlotte finally said, quiet almost to herself. But Jonas set the bridle down, and Charlotte found, when she finally looked up, that she couldn't quite look away from him. 2 weeks later, out by the corral where it had all started, Jonas finally said the rest of it. Charlotte, he said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get all the way through it. She nodded, still. I wasn't always a hired hand in a patched coat, he said. Before my wife passed, I ran my own spread, 300 head. Best horse stock in the county. Folks used to say I had a gift most men would trade a year's wages for. Buyers rode 2 days just to look at what I'd bred. I bred and gentled animals other trainers had given up on entirely. Same as that gray stallion of yours. He looked down at his hands. I lost most of it settling debts after she died. Doctor's bills, funeral costs. A bad drought the same year that finished off what the fever hadn't already. Sold the land, sold the stock, buried the name along with her, near enough. Told myself none of it mattered anymore. Not the reputation, not what I used to be, because the only thing left worth doing was raising Etta right. He looked up at Charlotte. I didn't come to Kestrel Ranch to fall in love with my employer, he said. But I have. I love you, Charlotte. Not because you're the iron miss who runs the biggest spread in the territory. Because you brought bad soup to my sick daughter at midnight, and never once made me feel small for needing help I was too proud to ask for. Because you stood in a storm at midnight beside me, and called it yours to stand in for. His voice caught just slightly. I've got nothing to offer you but a patched coat. Well, a new one now, thanks to you. A 6-year-old girl. And a reputation I let slip clean through my fingers. But I'm asking anyway. I'd rather ask and be turned down than spend one more year pretending I don't want this. Charlotte's eyes were bright. I need a few days, she said quietly. Not because I don't feel the same, Jonas. Because there's something I have to settle first, and it wouldn't be fair to you to answer before I do. Jonas nodded slowly, though something in his chest sank a little at the words. Take what time you need. Now, I'll tell you plain. A woman who's spent 6 months proving herself to a whole territory doesn't ask for time lightly. Whatever she needed to settle, you can be certain it mattered. What Charlotte needed to settle arrived at her gate 2 mornings later, in the form of Reginald Ashford, a cattle baron from 2 counties over, 38 years old, wealthy, respectable, and, as her late father's oldest friend and business partner, the man half the territory had quietly expected her to marry since she was old enough to be spoken of that way. Charlotte, he said, hat in hand in her parlor. I heard about the trouble with your feed supplier. Word travels. I heard about the hand you've got working your stock too. Decent enough, I'm sure. But a woman running a spread this size needs more than a hired man's help. She needs a partner who can match her, dollar for dollar, acre for acre, somebody the bank in Helena won't second guess. He smiled, warm and well-practiced, the smile of a man accustomed to people saying yes to him. Marry me, Charlotte. Combine the ranches properly, the way our fathers always talked about doing. Nobody will ever again ride up to your gate, thinking they can take advantage of a woman alone. You'll never have to prove yourself to anyone again, not to a supplier, not to a bank, not to some drifter with a horse trick. He's not a horse trick, Reginald, Charlotte said, evenly. He fixed what 4 trained men couldn't. I don't doubt he's useful, Reginald said, waving a hand. That's precisely the difference between us, Charlotte. He's useful to you. I'd be equal to you. It was, by any practical measure, the safest choice in the territory. No risk, no uncertainty. No patched coat standing between her and a lifetime of being taken seriously without a fight. Charlotte knew every argument Reginald could make before he made it, because she'd made half of them to herself. Alone, at 3 in the morning, more than once these past 6 months, Charlotte sat with it a long moment. Reginald, she said finally, you're offering me safety. I understand that, and I'm grateful for the honesty in it. My father always said you were a decent man, and I believe that's true. But, I built this ranch back from nothing in 6 months without needing anybody to even the ledger for me, she said, standing. I hired the trainers. I read every contract myself before I signed it. I caught the cattle rustling out on the east fence line, before Dale even noticed the count was short. I proved that on my own, Reginald. I don't need a husband who does it for me a second time, as though the first time didn't count. She crossed the room, steady now, the words coming easier as she found them. What I want is a man who stood at my fence in a patched coat and gentled a horse 4 other men couldn't touch. Not to impress me, but because it needed doing. A man who caught a cheating supplier and told me about it instead of pocketing the silence. A man whose daughter asked me plain as day why I hadn't married her father yet, because, to a 6-year-old, it was already obvious. Even if the 2 grown adults involved were too proud and too scared to say so first. Reginald's smile faded, replaced by something more resigned than bitter. He was, whatever else he was, not a cruel man. The hired man, he said. Jonas, Charlotte corrected, gently but without hesitation. His name is Jonas. Reginald nodded, turning his hat over once in his hands. My offer would have made your life easier, he said, not unkindly. I want you to know that much was true. I don't doubt it, Charlotte said. But easier was never what I was building toward, Reginald. I've had easier offered to me a dozen times since Father died. I turned all of them down for the same reason I'm turning yours down now. He showed himself out with what grace he had left, and Charlotte stood a long while in the empty parlor after he'd gone, listening to his wagon roll off down the road, feeling lighter than she had in months. That night, riding out to the barn under a hard, clear winter sky, Charlotte finally let herself think it all the way through, plain and simple, the way she should have from the very start. Every instinct that had rebuilt this ranch from ruin told her the same thing about Jonas Whitmore that it had told her about that gray stallion in the corral 3 months back. Some things aren't broken. They're only scared, and worth every bit of patience it takes to prove it. She found him in the barn at first light, checking on the stallion, same as every morning. I settled it, she said. He turned, bracing himself the same careful way he'd braced himself walking up to her gate months before. Reginald offered me an even ledger, Charlotte said. A marriage that would make certain nobody ever underestimated me again. And I told him I already proved that on my own 6 months ago. She stepped closer. You never once tried to even any ledger with me, Jonas. You fixed my fences without asking for extra pay. You caught a cheating supplier because it bothered you that something was wrong, not because you wanted credit for finding it. You stood in a storm at midnight because horses needed saving, and it never once occurred to you to wonder if I'd notice you doing it. She took his hand. My answer is yes, she said. Not because I need a partner to match me, because I want the one who never once tried to. Jonas let out a long breath, the kind a man lets out after holding his shoulders tight for far longer than he realized. I should warn you, he said, a smile breaking through at last. Etta's going to be unbearable about being right. Charlotte laughed, bright and unguarded in a way the ranch hands would later say they'd never once heard from the Iron Miss. Only if you ask me properly, she said. I believe there's a ring involved, in most versions of this. Don't have one yet, Jonas admitted. Then we'll pick one together, Charlotte said. Same as everything else, apparently. They stood there a long while in the cold barn light, the gray stallion watching them both with the same calm patience Jonas had once earned from him 3 months and a whole lifetime ago. They married in February, in the Kestrel ranch house parlor, a fire going against the cold and a small gathering of hands and neighbors filling the room, with one very solemn 6-year-old flower girl taking her duties with tremendous gravity. Charlotte wore her mother's wedding ring, reset with a small new stone Jonas had saved 3 months' wages to afford. Jonas wore a coat that wasn't patched, for once, a gift from Charlotte, though she swore up and down right until the vows were spoken that it was only leftover stock. Dale stood near the back, arms crossed, wearing the closest thing to a smile anybody had seen on him in years, and when the preacher asked if anyone objected, he was heard to mutter, quite audibly, "Best hire I ever recommended," and I never said a word about it either. Etta stood at the front, holding both their hands through the whole ceremony. refusing to let go of either one, and nobody in that room minded a single bit. When the preacher pronounced them married, Jonas kissed his bride in front of the very ranch that had once doubted a patched-coat stranger and his daughter at the gate, and the hands cheered loud enough to spook every horse in the stable. The gray stallion simply put his head over the stall door and watched, calm as could be. Montana Territory, 1893, 6 years on. Kestrel Ranch. Folks had taken to calling it Whitmore Kestrel, though Charlotte always said the name mattered less than the work behind it. Had grown into the largest, best-managed spread in 4 counties, its horse-breeding operation, drawing buyers clear from Cheyenne and beyond. Jonas's old reputation had found its way back to him over the years, not because he ever chased it, but because good quiet work has a way of being noticed eventually, whether a man wants the notice or not. A journalist from a Helena newspaper had come out the previous spring to write about the gray stallion's bloodline, now some of the finest in the territory, and had left calling Jonas the quietest legend in Montana horse country. A phrase Jonas found deeply embarrassing and Charlotte found deeply amusing, and which she still brought up whenever he needed taking down a peg. Etta was 12 now, spending most of her afternoons in the corral instead of the bunkhouse kitchen, having inherited her father's steady way with spooked animals, and her stepmother's flat refusal to be told something couldn't be done. She'd taken to training the young colts herself, under Jonas's watchful eye, and had already, at 12, gentled 2 horses the hands had given up on. Runs in the family, Dale liked to say, shaking his head fondly whenever he watched her work. On a cold December evening, Charlotte came in from the barn to find Jonas at the kitchen table, their 2-year-old son balanced on his knee, going over the account books by lamplight, a habit that had started, all those years ago, with a man who couldn't sleep and a column of numbers that didn't add up right. Papa caught another mistake in the feed order, Etta announced from the doorway, stomping snow off her boots. Same supplier as always. Some folks never learn. Some folks just need patience to figure themselves out, Jonas said, glancing up at Charlotte with a smile she'd long since stopped being surprised by. Same as horses. Same as most everybody, I've found. Charlotte crossed the room, kissed the top of their son's head, and settled into the chair beside her husband. She reached over and turned one of the ledger pages for him, an old habit now, and neither of them thought a thing of it. Outside the window, snow was falling soft over the corral where a gray stallion, gentled by patience 7 winters back, still watched over the property each night like something that understood, in its own animal way, exactly what it had witnessed take root there. Charlotte rested her head against Jonas's shoulder, in the warm, ordinary light of a Tuesday that had, once upon a time, needed nothing more than a scared stallion and a patched coat to begin it all. You know, turning this story over in my mind, here's what stays with me most. Charlotte didn't fall for Jonas because he proved himself worthy of her ledger. She fell for him because he never once tried to prove anything at all. He simply showed up, did the quiet, unglamorous work of caring for what needed caring for, and let the truth of who he was speak for itself, one mended fence and one honest word at a time. I think that's the lesson worth carrying home tonight. Don't waste your years trying to even somebody's ledger, trying to prove you belong at somebody's table. The right person was never counting in the first place. They were only ever watching how you treated a frightened horse, a sick child, a broken fence nobody else noticed needed mending, the small, unglamorous truths that no amount of wealth or status can ever quite fake. Thank you, sincerely, for spending this time with me tonight. It means more than you know that you'd choose to listen, wherever in the world you're hearing this from. Until next time, keep listening.